All right. So, for those of you who don't know, my name is Mike Vick. I am the state representative candidate in Indiana's 29th district, and I am here with Brian Matlock, who is U.S. Senate candidate for Kansas. I am running as a Democrat, and Brian is running as a Republican. But you might not know, and you're going to find out that Brian and I have very similar politics and really, honestly, very similar backgrounds. Um, Brian was raised in a Republican household. I was raised in a Democratic household. We were both raised in Christian environments. And I'm a deeply theologically conservative Christian still to this day. But my politics is very left leaning. I'm to the left of most of even the leftists that I know. So I just was fascinated to hear Brian's story just to be able to get to know him. He was kind enough to spend some time with me, talking with me on July 4th of all times, and just to get to know each other and talk about our various political positions. So Brian is here to share a little bit about what he means by Republican socialism. I thought that we would talk a little bit about his background and what brought him to this place. I'll talk a little bit about myself and my background as well. Just so that folks are aware, Brian may have contracted COVID, of all things, and as many people have. If he coughs a little during this broadcast, just bear with us. We're going to try to get this out on time. I had mentioned to folks that we were going to try to do this live, and I had said in some of my Facebook Live posts that I wasn't sure if it was going to work. Unfortunately, that came to pass. My bandwidth just couldn't handle doing a simulcast to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube all at once, and I wanted to make sure that people could actually listen to this and watch it without having crazy lag time. And we're gonna post it around the time that I thought we were gonna have it live. But anyway, go ahead, Brian, take it away.
Well, thanks for having me. Like you said, if I'm coughing a lot, it's just because I might be dying from COVID. So don't worry. Anyway, makes campaigning really fun, being trapped in a room right before the election. But yeah, so I'm running for the U.S. Senate in Kansas in the Republican primary. It's an open seat against many others, Chris Kobach, the most notorious among them. But basically, I identify as a Republican socialist. So a bit about how I got to this point. Growing up, I really valued the type of values and type of person that my parents modeled for me, because they were constantly donating, volunteering, opening their homes to others, raising kids who weren't their own, and helping out their neighbors. And that type of ethic of like pitching in and working together, caring about relationships more than about careerism and being really wealthy. Those sort of like simple working class values were all around me growing up. And my parents, I'm from Nampa, Idaho, which is an extremely Republican area and a Republican state and a Republican family. And I think as I grew up, I tried to live out a lot of those same values. I was initially a minister working in inner city churches and doing stuff abroad. And, you start evolving from this, like, you help out the poor family in church, and then suddenly you're in an area and it's like, whoa, this whole area has like poverty. And then you start to hear the experiences of people and see like the bigger problems and question like, what's going on here? And this isn't just a matter of individual decisions leading to poverty, as it can sometimes like, but that there are some systemic issues that we need to address. I continued to work first in social services, mental health treatment, and homeless shelters and things like that, but eventually decided to go back to work on a PhD in economics. And I've been working on that the last few years, teaching and researching, and just believe that, like, as I got more politically left in the sense of like realizing that we do need some systemic solutions and that there are some fundamentally broken ways the economy operates to create both wealth and poverty in the same process. And, but I realized what led me there was actually the values I got from my parents. And so I think there is like this, so Republican socialism to me is people who, in a way, distrust big corporations just as much as big government to have their best interests at heart, who care about that like hard work ethic and responsibility, but also realizing that we have to have each other's back, and that like small town and rural like communitarian ethic of like potlucks and barn raisings and all of these sorts of things where you see people coming together to produce something because we know we're in this together. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is healthcare, housing, and education costs have gone up, but wages have been stagnant. So business Republicans like to talk about, oh, all these freeloaders or something, but really it's like some of the hardest working people in our country are going without healthcare, our farmers and retail workers, all of these people, and it's increasing. We have some of the most expensive costs at the worst health outcomes of any of the similar nations. And so we need to address those structural problems, but in a way that doesn't just centralize all decision making. Now, one of the things that I think there are a lot of overlaps between the kind of like average working class Republican values and things the socialists care about. And one of the ways I realize this is through community development, actually, because in the post-war era, they sort of like, okay, we've done all this redlining and now we have like concentrated poverty in minority communities. What do we do about it? Oh, I don't know. Let's like, why are you poor? Well, oh, let's see. We have lots of problems. Poor eyesight. Let's hire an optometrist to go treat those. And so what they would do is they would define a community by what's wrong with it. They would pay outside experts to offer treatments that don't address root causes. And then we see it costs immense amounts of money, but none of that money ever drops in the community because those experts live outside the community and come in. So millions and millions go in, it immediately leaves, you can't build an economy. They give these like welfare checks, which are barely enough to survive on, but then it doesn't provide any way forward for the community. And so what has sort of replaced it is, it's called participatory development, or what is in the process of replacing it, where you involve the community's decision-making, their capacity, their dreams, like what do you want your community to be, and how can we support you in achieving that? And so resources are used to support actually like people working together to build solutions. And all of that came from like radical socialist organizing at the community level, because a lot of places like Kansas had a super bottom-up socialist movement about 100 years ago. And, you have farmers who, when there's free trade, they have to compete with everybody in the world producing the same stuff. So if you grow wheat, if you have beef, everybody growing wheat is all competing, so prices go down. But these multinational corporations that are coordinating these international affairs, they control the supply lines, the storage, the markets. They have like all this intellectual property rights and pricing power. So in the midst of the most wealth ever being created, it's all being sucked up by the people who are protected from competition. Meanwhile, everybody else is squeezed out. And so what the socialists did in Kansas is they were organizing farmers into cooperatives so that they could build silos and hold the wheat to wait till the prices were good enough so they weren't individual farmers who, I have to get my money now, I have to sell it, I have nowhere to like, and they were organizing miners against exploitative companies. So there's a whole history of this like bottom-up mentality where like we want to it's not about like, and so when we see like all of the things we can set local priorities, like want to fix our infrastructure, we want to have more care workers or more aid or more arts or more teachers aides in classrooms or things, and we can put people to work in the meantime, and then when the economies improve, and we can also support more local finance, and cooperative businesses so that ownership stays in the community rather than big corporations siphoning off profits and taking them elsewhere. So I think there are some shared values that we can start to build solutions from and escape this really fruitless partisan divide where we all have our own media sources that make more money when we're angry and scared. And we've seen the results of that. And it's not a productive or hopeful America.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Because
Yeah, so something that I thought was an interesting parallel between what you're talking about and sort of my politics is that I consider myself sort of a libertarian socialist in some of the the graphics that I put together that my graphics team put together. I called myself a democratic socialist, as opposed to you calling yourself a Republican socialist. I really consider myself more of a libertarian socialist, and that was sort of just to kind of contrast us in terms of like the named parties. But libertarian socialists have this ethic of being very distrustful of concentrated power wherever it happens to be, and whether it's within a centralized government. So libertarian socialists were always very distrustful of the authoritarian communist model of socialism, and indeed were among the first to have felt the sting of oppression under that model. Many were killed and were imprisoned, in the early part of the Russian Revolution. But also, in addition to being distrustful of an authoritarian government, whether that's authoritarianism on the left or fascism on the right, very distrustful of centralized corporate power as well. And so, I think that Republicans and Democrats are often coming at the same sort of problem from different sides. Republicans, especially working class Republicans like you were raised by, are often very distrustful of of centralized power in the government, and blaming big government for problems. And there are many problems that are created by central planning solutions like that. Um, and then Democrats will tend to be folks on the left, particularly in the Democratic Party, tend to be very distrustful of corporate power. They're both problematic, and they both sort of stem from the same authoritarian mindset that creates these situations in the first place. So I think that as you say, there's a lot of overlap. Now, one thing I did want to kind of get you to sort of address is when I had first shared this on Twitter, we got a lot of great response from folks who were very interested in the topic. We also got one kind gentleman who wanted to talk a little bit about the terrible aspects of what he thought you represented, and the idea of so-called Republican populism, and the ways in which some folks in the media have liked to frame the sort of left Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, and the so-called similarities between that and Republican populism as it's been shown under Trump. And I was actually intimately involved in pushing back against the idea that, number one, that there really were true similarities between the two. I think that one is a real response to the crisis that's been created by authoritarianism in our government, and really authoritarian capitalism in our economics. And that real response is sort of the not me us movement that for a time has been sort of centralized around the person of Bernie Sanders, and then this really what I would consider a astroturf as opposed to truly grassroots co-opting of that same sort of message by Mr. Trump. And so I wanted you to speak to that a little bit, because I don't believe that there is a fruitful pairing to be made between folks like myself who are on the left and believe in progressive economic populism, and the sort of right-wing nationalist economic populism that I feel is represented by Donald Trump. And so I think that the gentleman who responded thought that that was what you represented, and I don't believe that that is what you represent. So I wanted you to kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's an important concern that people have. A lot of times people just jump to that conclusion and then don't find out anything different. But because during the time in Germany, they actually had what's called a red-brown alliance, which is like this sort of like xenophobic, this xenophobic populism mixed with like more left inclusive populism. And there's something called the Night of Long Knives, where the Nazis like murdered all of the socialists who had been involved in any of the coalition.
Yeah, and if folks want to look this up, the term for this was Strasserism. It was Georg, I believe, or maybe it was Gregor Strasser, and he was a socialist, a rather muddled socialist, and many of the quotes that are attributed to Hitler that speak of them being socialists are actually quotes from Gregor Strasser that were misattributed to Hitler. And Hitler himself liked to co-opt the message of socialism in order to get popularity among the masses, and this is why you end up with the misnomer of National Socialism itself is because people don't realize in the 1930s, just like now, socialism was actually quite popular, and so to call your party a socialist party was actually a good thing, and so he sort of co-opted the left with the Strasserists and with some of the unions at the time that were willing to go along with him, and then just liquidated them, killed them all. And the Night of the Long Knives, outlawed socialist parties after the Reichstag fire, and so went on a reign of terror of anyone who smacked of leftism. So just, like I said, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to interject a little history for folks there, but go ahead and continue.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I think is important is that we recognize most people are just going about their lives like trying to live, and they aren't on Twitter all day learning about politics and things like that.
Right.
And I think the experience of a lot of just average working class people during this period of globalization, where, like I said, we've got all the increasing costs to live, but stagnant wages. People are going more and more in debt from medical debt and student debt and all of these things. And so they're getting squeezed out in the very period where we're producing more wealth than ever has been seen in human history. And it's frustrating. And at the same time, the massive globalization displaces people all over the place. Like, we're implementing new technologies. And so just farmers, like, using this high yield production technology gets rid of a lot of farmers. And so you see massive migration from rural to urban. You're seeing mass migration from, because now it's like one factory can produce enough for half the world. So you put out of business all of these local factories and local production shops. And so there's just incredible flux going on in society. And this, at the very time when things are getting tough and there's high rates of migration and it's easy, it creates a recipe where these nationalists can say, your problems are caused by the migration, and they ignore all of the actual systemic issues, and it just gives an easy scapegoat for problems. And something like, yeah, it is absolutely essential that we not do the Strassers thing, and like, and not even like mess around with associating ourselves with that type of xenophobia, both because it's like bad for them, and it's bad for all of us if we're not even addressing the root problems. We're
Right.
just getting distracted. And so I think some of the things, if we're going, but like working class Republicans have been having a really tough time during, like, you think about all of these agricultural states and all of these, like, and, but lefties used to be like organizing in all those areas. Now they're very urban, they're very intellectual, and frankly, they buy into a lot of the classist stereotypes that are prevalent among like pearl clutching suburban Democrats. And so they, like, throughout history, socialists have been like, okay, these people who society says have no value, they should be the ones making decisions. We should provide all opportunities to them and ownership and decision making to the average people. And the elite classes were always like, oh yeah, I'm sure Seamus could run the farm by himself. Oh yeah, I'm sure Moses, we'll just let him run the plantation. And it's like, yes, he literally can. You create the conditions by not providing education, by not allowing that, like, and so when we offer a liberatory, like, we care about the freedom and the value of all people, and it is a affront to the socialist tradition how condescending and elitist a lot of urban intellectual socialists are today. And of course, they're not going to like want to vote for someone who doesn't even like them. And part of the issue is rural areas are dependent on media to represent what's like, what's going on in poor minority communities and cities? Like, how did they get this way? What does it take for them to get better? And so they have these like imaginations that are different from reality. But similarly, also, people in cities have these imaginations of what people in rural and small town America are like.
Right.
And so we we have a lot of opportunities to build a different, to narrate what they're experiencing, to organize instead of allowing far-right nationalists to be the only ones who are like doing media and outreach in the communities and organizing. Like, this is why you're experiencing these hard stuff. It's their fault. And so I'm just saying, like, there are positive values people have. There are real struggles people have. And if we join and create an alternative and help them realize they actually have a lot in common with these poor displaced migrants, like in other countries and minority communities where your kids go off to college and they never come back because there's no opportunity. That's what rural America is facing right now. Like these sort of competition and corporations displacing people. Like, and so being able to create a narrative where we realize what we have in common and start working on that together, that is altogether different than like being okay with racism in order to get votes. Like, that's not at all what we're doing. We are actively fighting that rather than just pretending with this weird purity politics. Like, you know, nationalists and other far-right people have been the only ones organizing in those areas for decades. And now we're like, oh, organizing worked, so they must be naturally toxic people who are racist. And it's like, organizing always works, regardless of who's doing it. And so we need an alternative. And
Well, yeah, we do. And, you know, I think that, you know, you and I both live in red states where we've seen this, you know, where, you know, and obviously you are running as a Republican, you are a Republican. You've seen this from the other side as well, is that it's Republicans who are there on the ground talking to people in these communities, and the Democrats just aren't. And you know, it's a fact in my district. My district is, I believe, rated like an R+8 district, meaning that it's very solidly conservative. Now, the reality is there are a lot of left-leaning folks who just aren't voting because there's nobody on the ballot for them. And the reality is that we could be doing well, progressives, you know, whether we consider ourselves Democrats or Republicans or independents, could be doing well in those areas too if we even showed up. And so that's the problem, is it gets entrenched. If you don't show up this cycle and you don't show up next cycle and you don't show up for 20 years, then of course the people there are not going to believe in the things that you believe in, because they were taught by their parents not to believe in those things, because they never heard from anybody whether they should believe something else. So you're never going to get people on board if you don't try. And what I see the Democratic Party doing a lot is, you know, going after this mythical moderate Republican voter who's going to swing to the Democratic side, and neglecting this gigantic portion of the pie that isn't voting because they don't feel like there's anybody on the ballot worth voting for. And you know, so you know, I think that and then after the fact, of course, they blame people like me, people with my politics, who were maybe so disgusted with the choices that they chose to, you know, be one of the tiny sliver of folks who maybe voted for, you know, an independent candidate or a third party. You know, and so it's this vote shaming mentality that goes on within, particularly within Democratic Party circles, of you know, blaming voters when you, the politician, when you you know, you have one job on election day to win votes and you can't do it, so you start blaming voters for your failures, you know, as a politician and as a party. And so you know, I think that you know, it's a situation that could be, seen all across the country, whether it's a red state or blue state. But I've seen it, I've witnessed it all over the country. It's that kind of leads a little bit into something that I thought we'd talk a little bit about, which is just the electoral strategy. On my end, I'm running as a Democrat. I've been a Democrat my whole life. I would love to see the Democratic Party be the party that I thought that it was when I was a little kid. So you were raised as a Republican. Of course, you're going to run as a Republican. It makes sense. But I'm sure, and I've seen this in some of the Twitter streams and comments that just from stuff that I've been involved in personally with your campaign, folks pushing back on the left and saying, well, why didn't you just run as a Democrat? I can tell you, running as a Democrat isn't easy either. Being a leftist, I lucked into the fact that I'm running in an R+8 district, and nobody's super concerned about trying to flip it. So I ran unopposed in the primary. But in a normal sort of deeply blue district, or a swing district, there probably would have been at least 2, if not 3, 4 people running. And I know people personally here in Indiana who did run in the primary as progressive Democrats and got beaten badly. And that's not necessarily a reflection of the electorate. It's a reflection of the power structure and how easy it is for someone who is a centrist Democrat to get money and funding from the right sources and get access. And so, maybe talk just a little bit, we've already talked quite a bit, but a little bit about, what you saw as the strategy. You're not lying. You're not going into it as someone who, used to be a Democrat for your whole life and suddenly you decide to run as a Republican just as a joke, or, as some kind of scam. You're a Republican. And you have every right to view politics however you'd like. But I'm curious, your thoughts on that issue of why run as a Republican if you're left-leaning person.
Yeah, several things. What we kept seeing was these, like around the world, we're having globalization is creating these similar conditions of inequality, and what we're seeing is these Trump-like candidates, like nationalists and other things rising up, as well as, and it's like it keeps being them or some like status quo liberal who's like, oh, the masses, they're so like awful, give us back power and we'll safely entrust democracy in our all-knowing technocratic hands. And then they just continue the policies which create the conditions for these like really negative like anti-immigrant movements and things like that to arise. And so I was just so frustrated, like after the 2016 election with Hillary versus Trump, and then we saw another similar governor race here in Kansas that was like Kobach versus Kelly, and then we just keep seeing this around the world, these type of matchups, and I'm just like, this isn't going anywhere. And honestly, like looking at the Democratic Party in Kansas, they've done an even more significant job of suppressing candidates other than the one they want than the Republicans. Like I haven't been invited to official party debates, but at least local counties will invite me. And they've like kind of asked a few people to drop out so that they can get their preferred candidates. But we still have about 11 people running, I think, in the Republican primary.
Right.
But the Democrats have gotten all but one to drop out, like because they put so much pressure and just do not support. And then when I talked to one of the Democratic leaders, he was just like, well, we only need 10 counties to win out of 105 counties in the state. And that's they have no vision and they're just like, they think about it at the margin, or let's just barely get in. So this safe conservative strategy, let's not actually try to pursue anything, but then claim lots of moral superiority. We're going to abandon all these areas for decades, not organizing in them, but then blame those people for not voting for us as if you've done anything. And again, I think like growing up in red states, there's just so much condescension and self-righteousness among Dems. And like I said, it's so cultural, and it's like, who's going to vote for someone who doesn't like them? And so I think there are so many divisions. We've just seen this over and over conflict. Like socialists are actively sabotaged within the democratic machinery. And yeah, I've been sabotaged some, and I'm not exactly getting the red carpet treatment, but it's like my commitment is to the working class, wherever they are. Like people who are struggling, I want to organize them, and I want to figure out how to have a more equitable society where we take care of each other. And so I'm happy to do that in any party and build from shared values. Like, again, I grew up in a Republican household. My parents were pro-immigration, and my mom was like, I can't imagine being in dire poverty. And if I knew I could maybe provide a future for my kids by going across the border, I would do anything for my kids. And so I'm not gonna blame people who want that. And so I think there are some really beautiful, good values. And rather than this moralist scolding that goes on about here's all the things wrong with you, as if they themselves don't have their own problems, focus out and how do we build towards that. And I think there's just a lot to do there. So
right. Wrapping this up, I think that one thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is sort of where we go from here, which is to say, I'm in the Democratic Party. I again, been a Democrat my whole life. You are in the Republican Party. You've been a Republican your whole life. And I'm not going to, hold you to any, ideas about what you see for yourself for the future. But, I would love to get your thoughts on where you see things going just in general with how the parties are looking, because we're seeing a lot of movement within the Democratic Party to move to the left. And there's been, two presidential cycles where that was squashed by any means necessary. And we saw in the Republican Party this long lurch to the right, and a really far off the cliff lurch to the right with Donald Trump. And there's some tension there within the Republican Party. And of course, if Donald Trump loses, and I don't think there's any foregone conclusion, I'm sorry, Democratic Party, there's no foregone conclusion that he actually is going to lose. So any number of things that could happen between now and Election Day. But if he loses, there's going to be this sort of a retrospective within the Republican Party, should we continue down this path or should we go down another path? You could wind up having, a situation where the party splits, and could even become more than one party. The same thing, feels like it's happening to the Democratic Party right now. And we've seen this in our history. Our system sort of coalesces around two parties because of the way that we vote. Plurality voting tends to encourage a two-party system. Folks can study this, if you're interested, but the reality is that there's a systemic drive toward this polarization and toward these two parties. And I would love to see that change down the line, and see more room for independence, more room for third party candidates, and potentially a new major party that could displace the sort of sclerotic parties that exist right now, both the Republicans and the Democrats. But again, nobody has a perfect crystal ball, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on folks like us who are oddballs within the existing party structure, whether you think there's potential there and over the next several cycles to see some real dynamism and maybe folks going toward a new party.
I certainly hope. I think things are in flux, and it's hard to know how it's going to shake out. The Democrats have clearly not learned anything from 2016 and have done the same thing, just like wanted to focus on, ooh, Trump's screwed and vote for us. We're like status quo technocrats. And I don't know. I think it's likely that Trump will win. That's my opinion. I guess with COVID and various other things, it's like a lot more uncertain. But I think the Democratic establishment has shown they feel entitled to votes. They want to string people along like progressives, people of color, without actually delivering much. And it wouldn't be hard for anyone to offer more. And so I think we need to see a change. And how that, man, my Vicks Vapor Rub's wearing off. Here, I'll re-up. So how that shakes out, I do not know. I would love to see a similar populist party like we had here in Kansas that was winning elections all over the state 100 years ago. That is kind of like focus on the issues of everyday people, like trying to form a coalition between farmers and workers and all sorts of people who are getting a bum deal in the current economy and want real solutions. And there are some efforts to do that. It's a challenge. People are scared because they're like, it's risky to do something new, but it's also like people a lot of times would rather fail conventionally than to take a risk on doing something that might succeed. But I've always, running as a Republican socialist, I've always been a go big or go home. Let's try something different because what we're doing is not working. So I don't know, hard to say.
Well,
we need something different.
Yeah, we do. And so, just to close, obviously we both offer something different. I'll let folks know, where you can find my campaign. You can find me at www.votevic, that's V as in Victor, ICK, 2020.com, www.votevic2020.com. And you can find all my social media there. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I am on Instagram, I am on YouTube, and I am even getting on Twitch. I've got a young supporter, a young volunteer who's helping me out there. I didn't want to do that until I could really get someone who knew what it was all about. I didn't want to be the old man on Facebook who doesn't know what's going on or how to do it. So, coming soon on Twitch. But Brian, you can, share how people can find you. Of course, on my website, you can donate to our campaign. We need funds to get our message out. We are looking to do a video advertisement. We had a gentleman approach us with a very great offer of like, quarter price of what he would normally charge. But we need folks to come on board with some money to make that happen. We just recently got a generous contribution from the American Federation of Teachers here in Indiana because they endorsed our campaign. We definitely appreciate that. But more people come on board. Go to www.votevic2020.com and donate there. And you can just click on the donate button or click on the Victory Fund button. So Brian, you can take it away, let people know where they can find you as well.
Yeah, you can look at my website, www.matlockforsenate.com, as well as on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Kansas Brian, and Matlock for Senate, Matlock for Kansas. You can find me on Facebook, and yeah, subscribe. Got a primary August 4th, a couple weeks away. So.
Yeah. So head to Brian's page, take a look at what he's all about. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, and Independent, I think Brian has got a lot to offer folks, and I would love to see more folks come on board his campaign. Whatever state you happen to live in, if you're watching this from Kansas, check him out for sure at Kansas Brian. We will continue this conversation on social media. We'll be posting this shortly. And again, we apologize, folks who were expecting us at 8 o'clock sharp Eastern time, 7 o'clock Central. We will have it up as soon as possible. Thank you, Brian, so much for joining me. We'll keep the fight going.
All right. Take care. Thanks. Bye.